Alright, so if I create a basic plane inside of Maya here, this is just a very, very simple plane. I hope you guys have created, I hope, objects before in Maya, right? Okay, so just got to change my display options actually a little bit. Display, reduce, there we go. Okay. So we've got this simple plane here. Now, a plane is easy enough to basically throw a texture on. It's kind of already got a pre-built sort of set of UVs in. And if we look at the polygon tab here in Maya, the basic objects that are in here, the sphere, cube, cylinder, all this stuff. So let me just kind of draw your attention to that there. All these things have kind of basic UVs put into them. And I'll show you how to sort of work with textures and how we can kind of adjust these things. So you want to make sure you're in the modeling menu when you're doing any kind of UV editing. The modeling menu is where we kind of deal with any kind of mesh editing, modeling, and of course our UV. So the UV panel is right here in this menu, and then we've got the UV editor. Okay. So when you open up that, you'll see the UVs. Now, UV spaces are typically square. So even if your object is not square, you'll have to unwrap it and fit it into this sort of workspace. Now this works totally fine because the plane is square, the UV space is square, right? It works great. Okay, so I'm going to just close this for a second. So let's say I want to apply a material to this. Have you guys applied materials to objects yet? Yeah? Okay. So you've kind of done a bit of this before. I have this image that I don't know why I do some of the things I do, but so I downloaded a picture of this guy. All right, I'm going to throw him onto the mesh. Okay, so I'm going to just get the path for that. So there's a couple ways to apply materials. I'll show you the super fast, easy way, which I'm getting in the habit of using right now, which is to simply select the object, right-click, go to Assign New Material. Okay, that's right at the bottom. So you right-click and hold it, move down, Assign New Material. Okay, so this gives you pretty much a huge list of materials that are available in Maya. Now, a lot of materials are specialized, so there are some materials that are designed more for metallics, some that are designed more for glass, some that are designed for video game exports, some that are designed for environment effects like ocean surfaces, fog, that sort of stuff. So these are materials, or sometimes referred to as shaders, which kind of control surface properties. I would say for like 80–90% of the stuff that I do, I may use a blend material or a Phong material. So in this case, I'll go with blend. It's probably what we'll just use safely throughout most of the semester. So you see it kind of pops over to the right side. There's a whole bunch of properties, right? So if I want to load a basic texture map onto this, I'm simply going to click on the little checker box right here next to color, and that will pop up another selection box. So I'm going to get another floating menu. So this is what's called a render node. Basically, a render node is something that can feed into this kind of major bucket, which is the material. So the material holds all the properties, but we can kind of feed extra little bits of information in. So I'm going to grab File right here. Oops, let's move that out of the way. So I'll grab the file, and then I'll just simply load that picture of the crusty guy. So where is he? Come on, crusty guy. There he is. Okay, so I'm going to grab this image. Now, if you notice inside Maya, there's no display of the texture. It's actually in the material that's on the object, but it's not visible. So there's a few shortcuts that we should learn for Maya. The first one is number 4, which shows basically your whole scene in wireframe. So that means that all the polygons, they're not shaded. They're basically, the polygons are invisible, but the edges and the vertices are visible. So that's number 4. Number 5, it's flat shading, and you can see the wireframe still. Number 6 is shading a surface, and the textures and materials are visible. So when you want to preview, this is a good way to preview your materials inside of Maya. Now, you may notice something. There's an issue, right? What's the issue? The texture squished, right? So we have a couple of different remedies for this. One remedy is to go into your UV editor. So again, that's just in the menu system, UV editor. Now mine's already open. Now I can't see the material, but if I click on this little icon right here, this little kind of mountain icon with a little dot, right? It's going to now preview this thing in the UV editor. So I can sort of see the relationship between the model, the UVs, and the texture, how it's all fitting together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click in the window here, go to shell, and this grabs kind of the whole UV shell. In more complex objects, you actually will split apart the object into just separate little shells or islands. Some people use different terms for it depending on the software and whatnot that they use. So what I can actually do is go in here and scale this almost like I would scale the object. And if you notice, I can get this thing in more proportion, right? By scaling the UVs. Technically, the object scale is not changing, but the UV scales are. So that's kind of what I was saying, is there's a bit of a loose relationship between the distance of actual vertices on the 3D object and its 2D sort of cousins, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. So that's one way to kind of get this thing distortion free, right? Problem is, and this is another kind of weird thing about UV editing, is that that square workspace. Outside that square workspace, you notice there's 3 other boxes. Anytime your UVs move outside of the main workspace, that texture is actually truly repeating outside of the square over and over and over again. This will come in handy. I'll probably talk about this a bit later on, but so you see, you know, one of the issues is that I'm getting the texture now repeating. I don't know if I can. I don't remember how to turn on the repeat or show visible here for the tiling, but let's see. Yeah, I'll have to come back to that and sort of show you guys later on. But so yeah, this might be a good example actually. So you see these are what's called UV tiles. The UV tiles repeat infinitely, essentially. So that image, that's why we're picking up parts of the image on either side, because I've scaled the UV shell beyond its current UV tile space. So that's a bit of a problem. I don't necessarily want to see, let's say, that texture bleeding out across the other sides. So I've got a couple ways to deal with this. First way would be to, let's say, go to edge mode. So I'm going to right click in my 3D viewport. I'm going to be in edge mode, so I'm going to shift right click and go to multi-cut. And I can see where that texture line kind of starts, right? So if I hold control and then left click on an edge, that puts a cut there. And I'll do the same thing, hold control, put a cut there. I'm going to switch back to my select tool, or W, which is my select and move. And I'm going to shift double click this, shift double click that, and delete that. So that's one kind of way to deal with this if I don't want the excess and the repetition. Okay. So now I get a pretty good fairly non-distorted version of this. But there's another way to deal with this problem. So I'm going to undo. Let's undo, bring this all back. Make sure, okay, so everything's back in there. Everything's square. What I did earlier today is simply, let me just open this, I guess, with Photoshop. Yeah, the edits. There we go, Photoshop. So I'm just going to open up the image. Like I said, so 3D software, in most cases, it's ideal to work on your UVs and your textures in a perfectly square image size. There are a couple of standards for image sizes in 3D textures, and they're usually in multiples of 16. So it's 16 pixels by 16 pixels, 32 by 32, 64 by 64, and so on. So we go up to, and we refer to these as 1K, 2K, 4K, and 8K textures, right? So 2048, 4096, 8192. A lot of games and movies, they're all working now usually at 1 to 2K and above in terms of textures. In this case, in the case of this image, where did it go? Let me just drop it in here. Oops, oh, he's over here. There he is. Try to get away. Huh? Alright, so I'm just going to, what do we do? Just make this a tab because I don't like the view. There we go. So for me, a simple way to fix this is I want to make the image square. So a simple adjustment is to go to Image, Canvas Size, right? And if it's set to pixels, I can see the pixels. So I basically want to take the larger of the two numbers, copy that, paste that in, okay? Now it's going to extend the borders of this, the width of this. Now it's a square texture. If you really cared about the color, you could simply go in and change the background color. So I could change that to black. Let me undo and just go back to canvas size and paste that number back in. So it's got black borders. So I saved this. I'll just save it over this thing. So I'm going to just swap out or replace the texture in Maya now, right? So we're kind of back to our distorted version. So I have to go back to the blend material over here. Okay. And then back into the color option over here. And then I'll click on the little folder icon to swap out or load a different version of that texture. So I'll go, yeah, it's this one here. Now I know for sure this has 0 distortion. It's not stretched, it's not squashed in any way. So that's good, nice and clean. Okay, so I'm going to make a new scene. We're going to kind of go through objects. I'll give you guys another demo on how this all works, and then you guys will take a break, and you guys will do this on your own. So when we're kind of in the process of unwrapping, a lot of times that basically means we want to check for a bunch of things. The main thing, excuse me, is distortion. We don't want distortion in the unwrap. So on a basic plane, like I said, this is pretty much straightforward. It's already pre-unwrapped. It's square. But one of the things I like to do is create a checker material. So the checker material acts as a way to sort of test for distortion. So let's right click on this, assign new material. I'll go to blend again. Now over on the right hand side here, I'm going to click again on that next to color, go to the checker box and load an actual checker texture. Okay, so that's right here. And once that's loaded, it's going to load a repeated checker pattern on my object. Now, I also want to reuse this material. So I'll come back to naming this in a second, but naming your objects and your materials is something you should try to do immediately. Like, start organized and stay organized. Something else I like to do for the checker, I like to make it kind of light gray and white. I find it's just a little bit less visually distracting. It still allows me to see if there's issues on the model, and a little easier on the eyes. Another little step that I take, very important, is this thing. So right next to checker, you see place 2D texture. Now, if we really want to see what's going on here, I'm going to show you this. Let's go to the Hypershade. So Hypershade is basically the material editor inside of Maya. By the way, if you guys want me to repeat or go over something again, I will absolutely do that, so don't hesitate. So Hypershade's going to open up. So the upper right corner is kind of a quick preview window for the material and what it might look like on a more complex object. So this is a really good thing. The upper left kind of quadrant is basically the current materials in your scene. So in every Maya scene, these three materials, the Lambert, Particle Cloud, and Shader Glow, these things are kind of automatically generated and available. So a lot of people, when they just are modeling and stuff, they'll just use the standard Lambert that sticks on the object automatically. For me personally, I prefer just putting a blend on. So yeah, coming back to naming, right? If you go over to the right hand side, just below, there's all the settings of the material, just like you'd see in the attribute editor. So what I would probably do is right away, I want to use this texture and probably reuse it multiple times in other objects. So what I'm going to do is start by giving this thing, when I name stuff in Maya, I like to think of kind of the broad category first, then a specific object, and then its specific properties. So broad category would be material, so I usually type mat for material. This will be, usually I want to identify it, so I'm just going to call it blend. And then I'm going to put an underscore and then put in checker, right? Or I could call it UV check, let's say. Might be a good way to call it UV check. Now you might wonder why underscores and not spaces. This gets into technical problems that can happen. When you copy files across a network sometimes and there's spaces, computers are kind of dumb. Sometimes they'll put random characters in between instead of spaces because certain software doesn't handle it well. So as a general rule, when naming files, underscores instead of spaces. All right, that's a broad strokes rule that will save your life in this program. Okay, so that's kind of the properties areas, the lower right portion below the little preview window. The window on the far left, lower far left, is basically your creation window. So you can create new materials here. You can add new nodes and stuff and plug them into the material. And if you want to see, so let's say if you want to see how this material is actually set up, this blend material that I have, you can simply left click on it once, right click and say graph network. So you have to pull down, right click, pull down, graph network. You see that? And what it's going to do is it's going to pop that up into the work area right here. So now you can sort of get an idea, let me just full screen this for a second, of kind of how the material works, right? So this is sort of a broader shading group. This is your actual material. So this shading group is kind of created automatically and sort of hidden for you. This is your blend, and then this is a checker, right? So you can see the checker color is feeding into the main color of the material. And this 2D, place 2D texture, so I wanted to mention this as well. This place 2D texture. This is telling the checker material how many times to repeat. You guys see that? Repeat UV. So in actuality, this checker pattern technically looks like this, right? It's 2 white squares, 2 gray squares, or black squares. For me, when I'm checking UVs, I almost always set my UV repeat to 20 by 20. Now, you might wonder, what the heck do the checkers represent? Well, the checkers are sort of your equivalent to pixels. Pixels are square, checkers are square. Sometimes when you look at UVs, they're distorted, they're stretched, they're not square, they're rectangular. That tells you that if you try to paint the UVs to then bring back onto the model, you're going to have to paint in a distorted way to match the distortion of the UVs. So it's a constant battle of trying to make sure you have as little distortion as possible when you do an unwrap. Now in this case, this thing works totally fine, right? But let's see what happens if I change the dimensions of this thing. Because Maya generates this stuff automatically, if this thing were wider, let's say twice as wide, now it doesn't look so bad, right? Let's say it's 4 times as wide. Let's say it's 12 times as wide, right? So the checker is still showing up okay. Let's go to the UV editor. And if you take a look, again, I'll show you this option. So I like to turn this off and on depending on the situation. This little mountain icon is basically the material preview in the UV editor. I usually like this off in most cases. So you see as I change the proportionality of that plane, it's matching it and fitting it so there's no distortion in the UVs. Now you might wonder, well, what about all this wasted space, right? We have workarounds for this. So one of the workarounds is simply this. I'm going to right click, go to face, grab half the faces. By the way, Maya has this amazing thing. If you shift right click or I think control right click, does that do something else? Yeah. Control and I think alt, no, alt doesn't do that. So control right click gives you a set of options. In this case, most of your editing options are shift right click. See that? So in shift right click with these faces selected, I could say, let's create a new shell, create a UV shell. So what's that going to do? That's actually now going to break this thing into 2 pieces. And check this out. If I grab these 2 pieces, I could scale them, I could fit them. But I'm lazy, so I'm going to go polygons, layout. Boom, using more of the space. I want to fill up even more of the space. Let me go to face mode again. Maybe I'll break these 2 down. Shift, right click, create UV shell. So I'm now creating 2 totally new shells. I've got these other 2. If I grab it all, polygons, layout. So I'm trying to utilize as much of the space as possible. Yeah.
Why do you only grab half?
Right now it's just a demo. I mean, it's very arbitrary. In a lot of cases, though, let's say if you wanted that long piece of mesh And if you wanted to put like a big sign on it, I wouldn't cut it, because then how do you match up the edges of the UVs when you're painting in Photoshop? It'd be like a nightmare, right? So I'd want to go back to this edition. So I would just, and by the way, if you want to export to Photoshop, it's polygons, UV snapshot. Yeah, let me just put this on my D drive really quickly so you guys can see that. Whatever, test, yeah. Test is always a good name. So great. What? For some reason it doesn't want to print out. Let's try this again. UV snapshot. Okay. Okay, so that's sort of snapshotted out. So if I just go back to the D drive. So if you take a look, yeah, it's not a really good display. So this is actually what's sort of happening here. You guys see the little white lines on the left? So that's where you put your sign or whatever, right? So, but yeah, that's another issue. Is you want to maximize, use as much of that square space as possible. The problem is that sometimes you can't, right? So that's when sometimes people will tweak the space and make it non-proportional, but graphics cards, rendering software, it's all optimized for square texture spaces. So it's generally going to be better for you and give you quicker render times and give you an easier time of working in your projects if you keep these things square. So don't worry, you guys might get a little lost. This is a lot of theoretical stuff. We're going to come back and do it together as a group after this little demo. So let's move on to some other objects. I'll just undo this, bring that back. So a sphere, let's create a sphere. Okay, I'll move this thing over. Now, you can do this one of two ways. If you want to assign materials to objects, now I want to reuse the same checker material. I highly recommend this. When you create materials, you name them. And if you have if you have multiple objects to unwrap in one Maya scene, use the same checker material. Don't create a new one after a new one after a new one. It just, you're adding a bunch of junk in your scene, and if your project keeps going forward into your short film, whatever, all that extra junk can weigh down on your production at the end. So you want to kind of keep things a little neat and clean. So a couple different ways to apply materials. You can either go to the hypershade, middle mouse click and drag from the work area, right, from this upper left corner, middle mouse click and drop it onto the object. For me though, I find the hypershade kind of ugly and like very busy. So I really just like selecting my object, right click, assign existing material. And because I labeled my material, I know exactly what to apply, right? So there's a checker. Okay. There's an issue. Can anybody tell me what the issue is? Right, some distortion, right? So some weird little distortion as we get towards the top. This is partly because this is what's called a non-polar sphere. It's a polar sphere. So this basically means there's like a north and south pole. All the edges that kind of form the profile, right, like this, all these kind of edges, they're all kind of connecting into one point at the top and one point at the bottom, right? Whoa, whoa, Maya. So that's a bit of an issue. So there's a few ways around this. So you guys may be wondering, like, how do we, at this point I'd want to start slicing up the model to get rid of the distortion. So I've got a couple little tricks for this. I'm going to just hit 4 on my keyboard. And what I want to do is grab pretty much like a top and bottom circular selection of polygons. So I'll usually do both at the same time. So I'll grab one right at the pole at the top and bottom, right? And I use this amazing shortcut. It's shift greater than or shift period. And you see that expands the selection. Shift comma will shrink the selection. So usually what I do is I'll do shift period to expand the selection. And I want this to be nice and even. So I'm going to control deselect the kind of excess polys that I have. And now I'll do shift expand, okay? So I've kind of got the poles covered. I want to work out the distortion in that area. Let's check out our checker. I'm going to keep open the UV editor as well so we can kind of see what's happening. So this is why it's distorted, right? In all these preset objects, Maya has a bunch of math going on in the background to generate a sphere, generate a plane, generate a cylinder and a cube, and it kind of comes automatically with this instant UV system. But, like I said, if there's specific cases where you cannot have distortion up here, you have to do something different to the UVs. So there's a few different ways to cut this apart. You know, you could manually go in here and say shift right click create shell, but I don't really want to do that. There's actually kind of a quicker one-step or two-step process to helping eliminate distortion out of here. So one way is to go into UV. So the UV menu, and we pretty much have these three types. There's actually more like 4 or 5 types of options here, but there's something called planar. So what planar will do is it'll look at the selected parts of the model and create kind of a UV shell based on its point of view. Now if I just click on it, you're going to see something, right? First of all, it creates this plane. That's why it's called planar. It creates a plane and it kind of looks at this thing from a snapshot. Now look at it in the UV editor. The problem is it's looking at it from a side view, not necessarily from a top-bottom view, right? So the UVs are still distorted. They might look fine from a front sort of point of view, right? They look kind of squarish, but once you sort of look from above, they're distorted. So there's some other options. If I go back to UV, back to planar, as a general rule, by the way, now maybe I'm a little psychotic with this or like anal, I guess, but anytime I see an options box next to a tool, I almost always go to the option box instead of clicking on the tool, because I know there's settings in there that I can use to get the best out of my work, basically, and save time as well. So I'm going to hit the box, options box. So what this is, it's like a projector firing from one point of view. That's why it's on the x-axis, which is basically like your left to right axis. So that's why we got this sort of side view. I want kind of a top to bottom or up and down vertical view. So I'm going to go y-axis, and then I'll hit, if you want to keep the window open in case you need to change the option, you can just simply hit apply, which will keep it open. If you hit project, it'll apply it and close it. So I'll go apply, and now you see, right, from a top view, distortion free. So this is where the art of UV editing comes in, is we want to try to minimize extra seams or shells, but at the same time we want to try to minimize distortion. So it's kind of a tug of war between those two things in UV editing. Okay, so I'm going to close that. Now there's another issue, a couple of issues. Does anybody have an idea what those are? Right. So anytime you see a mismatch in the checker pattern, the smaller the checkers, or the more checkers in a given space, that means there's more pixels dedicated to that area than another area which has larger. So you got to think about it. Larger checker pattern means less pixels. Smaller checker pattern means more pixels. That's one issue. The other issue is that if you look in here, right, these shell pieces, they're overlapping. So whatever texture you put in, anything that's in the same space will pick up the same pixels. So usually we have to kind of rearrange the space. Now, you guys are so lucky. Back like 10 years ago when I started, you had to like scale things by hand and then like arrange it all, right? And place it by hand. It was like a nightmare. So you'd have to do all this and fit it in the square and make sure it didn't, you know, screw up. So here, let me just undo this a bit. Now we have great tools. You just select everything, go to polygons, and go to layout. Okay, so layout's going to pack everything. Now, I think I left an option on from earlier today, so I'm going to just turn this off so you guys can see. The default option when we go to layout, okay, it's going to keep the relative proportions. So you see the one piece on top has a smaller checker, the rest has a larger. So when you do a layout, it keeps a certain degree of proportionality. It's doing it, oh man. This, I should warn you guys, this tool is a little bit broken in this version of Maya, so one sec. Try it again. Polygons, layout. So if I do just a layout by default, which is the way it should behave for you guys when you first use it, right? It's going to keep the mismatch between the pieces. So the setting I like, again, I always go to the options box because I can keep it open and keep testing until it works the way I want it to. So I'll hit F5. There we go. So yeah, I'm just going to hit the little options. And The one option that I changed is right here. It's called Prescale. Now, I've noticed in this particular version of Maya, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't work, it's not you, it's the software. So you may have to manually scale by hand certain pieces, possibly, but in general, this should work. So if you do a layout and you're like, it's kind of weird, right? So if I do a layout, it's still mismatched. Simply switch to Object, go down, hit Apply. Boom, everything's proportional now, right? So what it's doing is it's kind of checking the actual object scale and its proportionality to the UV scale and proportionality. Yeah.
For each island, would they be touching at one point, or can they be completely separate?
Yeah, they can be completely separate. I mean, the way Maya does this, yeah, and you can see down here, if you look at this option, shell spacing, we could probably bump that up a little bit. It's a little too low. So we could bump that up to 0.5 and watch what happens when I apply. Now, kind of hard to see. Maybe I'll really crank it up to 5. Hit Apply. So you see they have a huge gap now between them. It's probably safer to bump the spacing up to 1, because you also don't want things right up against the border. I don't want to get into it, but there are additional reasons why that is. Yeah, we'll talk about it later. It's too much to cover. Okay, so now, I mean, the space is being fairly well used. I could try to optimize the space possibly by, splitting the bulk of this thing in half. So let me just go to face mode instead of shell. I could try to maybe split this thing off into a half. Maybe. Now, keep in mind there's still some distortion going on here, right? Chances are I could live with that distortion, and I'll show you why in a second. So let's say, again, going back to this idea that I have to put a label on this or put some writing on or a pattern because it's a bouncy ball with a certain pattern. I would probably leave it like this in that case. If I had a general texture on, I might, like a concrete or something, I might try something a little different. So if we go back to shell mode, there's this great tool. So we can actually kind of get a more accurate unwrap by going into polygons. Unfold. All right, that's right here. So what unfold does is it literally will look at the piece that you have and try to get it as distortion free as possible. Now you might wonder, how the hell do you see distortion in UVs? There's a little button right here in the window, right? Now, right now it's not bad. White is good. Blue or red is distorting in one direction or another. So right now it's actually not too bad. If I grab this piece, I could try to get it as distortion free as possible by going into unfold. It's actually getting worse. But it's going to try to kind of match, right? So there's still a checker pattern, but you see you don't have the same kind of distortion at the edges like you did before, right? So it's kind of fixing one problem but creating a different problem altogether. So unfold I love for more organic, complex characters like human characters, animals, creatures, whatever. Unfolding is great. So you literally would just go, just grab a piece like an arm, do a quick cylinder unwrap. I'll show you cylinder in a second. And then you just do unfold to get a more distortion-free version of that body piece. We'll deal with that in a couple weeks when we come up to the bigger unwrapping stuff, but just want to implant the ideas right now. Okay, so that's a sphere. Let's move on. Cylinder. Or maybe a box. Yeah, let's do a box. Oh, by the way, I've got a trick for boxes. So I'm going to do the same thing. Assign existing material. Right-click, assign existing. Blend. Right? And if you take a look in the UV editor, the box is laid out essentially like a box. It's unfolded like a box. That's kind of the best way to think about unwrapping is, think about clothing, right? In a complex character, you typically have a seam at your sleeves, one at the top of the sleeve, then a slit on the underside of the arm usually, one on the sides. That's almost exactly how you'd unwrap a human or humanoid character. And think about fabric and fashion. It's giant 2D sheets of fabric that you're wrapping around a 3D thing, which is you guys. So that's kind of the idea. Same thing, boxes are kind of the same thing. So, if I wanted to minimize seams, I could try and do something kind of different here. I could go into face mode, shift right click. I'm going to say create shell, which allows me to break this off. What's kind of cool too is you can go to edge mode and say, well, maybe this thing could fit better somewhere else. So maybe, let's see, over here, I could go shift right click, move and sew. So we'll move the piece over. Oh God, nope. Wrong edge. Let me try here. Yeah, I'll try this area here. Shift right click, move and sew. You see it jumps over, stitches it up. So I can rearrange shells that way too, which is very, very useful. So maybe I'll grab this edge and I'll go cut UVs. It's kind of like going create shell because it's a border edge. I go to shell. This is now a standalone piece. Oops. Did it work? Yes. There we go. So I'll go to edge mode, grab another edge maybe over here. Shift right click, move and sew. So you could change the layout. Yeah.
So if you do something like that and like, let's say the bottom of the cube needs to be something specific, is there a way to like label which shell is the bottom? Or do you
Yeah, that's actually a good question. There's a little bit of guesswork. Yeah. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll just write numbers, or like just short form letters. So B for bottom, T for top, and then sides, right? Yeah. So that's your, yeah, it's a good question because it sometimes gets a little bit tricky and weird. Now I want to show you a little trick. So I mentioned the nonpolar sphere. Its issues are kind of bizarre. There's a little trick. If you want a nonpolar sphere, so I'm going to just Control D, duplicate, move this over. You can do this one of two ways. You can either go to the menu and go to Mesh. My preference is to simply go, you guys use the hotbox at all? Spacebar, right? So spacebar actually brings up your menu, but it's right at your fingertips instead of you moving across the whole screen. By the way, I love this part of the controls in Maya. So hotbox controls on the right side. You literally left click and hold, and you can go modeling only, rigging only, lighting only. So it strips down the menu to exactly what you need. So I'm going to go, oops, yeah, let's get out of the full screen here. Mesh, and then smooth. And you see it's actually turning this thing pretty much into a sphere. So if I set the divisions to 3, I get a nonpolar sphere with UVs that are fixed. I'm full of cheap tricks. I love this stuff. But if you take a look, it's technically still a square unwrap. So you probably would go in. I mean, I could technically go polygons, unfold, which will try to be more distortion free. This might actually crash, I think. I just realized, no. Yeah, because there's a lot of weird seams, and I don't think the unfold tool likes it. So, no, it's not going to crash. Okay, well. Worst case scenario, I can do kind of what I did earlier, right, which is to grab, let's say, the top 4 here, expand this out. Actually, let's do the bottom at the same time. There we go. Right? Simply go into UV, planar options. It's already, notice the other beautiful thing. When you go to those option boxes, it'll keep your settings from the last time, and I think even when you restart Maya, it keeps those old settings. So a lot of times you'll learn, like, you like tools set a certain way. After a certain point, you won't necessarily have to go back into the options because they'll be set up exactly the way you like. Okay, so that's that. Let's go back in. Again, see, these pieces are a little bit warped. You can see a little bit of distortion. So I may have gone too far with the unwrap, but I could try maybe just unfolding those and seeing what happens. Yeah, it's a little better. So it's actually worked out the distortion, right? So unfold's kind of great for this. Instead of you having to do this nightmare by hand, unfold tries to flatten things out and minimize distortion in more complex unwraps. It's a bit of a deadly tool in Maya 2016 though, because it is a little crash happy. I will warn about that. But and if you check out the distortion, right, mostly white, fairly distortion free. Okay, so let's go to a cylinder. Where are you at? Oh my God, cylinder. Why cylinder? Okay, so I'm going to move this thing over. Let's go object mode, slide this thing over. Now, chances are, again, this thing already has UVs because it's a pre-built object. I'm going to right-click it again, assign existing material, material blend, right? Checker. Now, what's the issue? Very clear, right? It's not proportional. So it's stretching across the circumference, I guess, of the cylinder. So that is basically this piece. It's very clear to see it's a separate shell, right? Simple fix for this is to simply warp the proportion by scaling it across one axis. So I'm simply going to hit R, By the way, I hope you guys know your shortcuts. W is move, right? E is rotate. R is scale. And then I just scale it until it's approximately checkered. Square checkers. Seems good enough. Grab everything. Double check my settings. I think it's set to object, which will make it proportional. Hit apply, and there you go. Right? Now if I want to, again, try to maximize the space, I'll grab half this part of the shell. And if it's, let's say, a bottle or something, I know I could put a front and a back label. It would make sense to split it, right, in half, because then I could easily not worry about the seams and still place labels on the appropriate sides of the objects without worrying about that. So I'll go, what was I going to do? Shift, right click, create shell, and then we'll go layout, right? So that works out pretty well. And by the way, I should mention this too, you know, when it comes to unwrapping, you know, certain areas may require certain things. So you can easily go in and grab a section like this, right? And if you want just that to be more of a cylindrical unwrap, you can always go UV, cylindrical, right? Creates this little cylindrical piece. Again, this thing is a little goofy. It doesn't cover the whole thing right away, so I usually will make sure it goes around. Again, I think that's in the settings. Let me go back in to cylindrical. Yeah, for some reason this doesn't give you the settings before applying, so unfortunately you have to change this every time, but there you go. And then you would just rearrange your layout here. So you can just go in, pack everything up. So I'll just do a quick layout. And of course there's the distorted shell, so I'll grab, I think it's that shell right there. Scale it to until it's approximately proportional. Then we can go in, layout, make sure we're on object. There we go. All right, so you know that specific area could be like a label area that's very key. Can't be split, right? All right, so hopefully that gives you an idea, right, of how to kind of work with UVs. I'll do one more. This is like kind of the annoying, there's a couple of like annoying examples where things get kind of frustrating, so it's always good to sort of see how that works. Again, I'll right click. This is a torus, or donut if you want to call it that. So the way 3D software deals with this, the way it unwraps, is kind of ingenious. I'll show you how this basically works. So what a torus essentially is a cylinder. So we'll take this to a height of like 15. Give this some division so I can bend it. And then we'll go to deform, don't worry about this deforming stuff here. Curvature at 180. That's essentially, right, a torus. So it's pretty much a cylinder folded in half. And a cylinder, the way the 3D software looks at it, it actually just looks at it like a plane that's been bent around into a tube shape. So really, it's almost like a cylinder or a donut. The way it's unwrapped is that it's basically a flat plane. So when you open up the editor, it's a flat plane. It's been bent in one direction into a tube shape and then bent again into a donut shape. Make sense? So that's kind of how the unwrap works. Now, default torus donut is fantastic. I would not touch the unwrap unless I absolutely had to. So let's see if I absolutely have to. I like the worst case examples sometimes. They're kind of fun because I'm a sadist. I'm insane. So the way to deal with this is to, there's a few ways. How do I explain this? Okay, so what I could do is either treat this like a cylinder, right? So I just go to face mode. By the way, to select all, Control-Shift-A selects all the polys or all the vertices depending on what sub-object mode you're in, right? So Control-Shift-A selects all of these polygons. I could go into UV, go to cylindrical, right? Again, I'm going to make sure it's fully covering this. You know, maybe I'll leave it actually. It's turning out okay. So there's distortions. So one of the distortions is this. Remember, I said it treats it like a plane that's kind of bent in two ways. Yeah.
My USB was left.
Yes, it was. Where did I put it? There you go.
Thanks.
No problem. So, so what's happening is you're actually not quite getting full coverage. You're seeing this thing almost from like one point of view, but as soon as you look towards the top, it's actually stretching across the top and the bottom, and then it's repeating that texture. So that, like this polygon here is going to probably pick up the same texture as this one on the opposite side inside, right? Because it's kind of going like right through the object. So we want to start kind of splitting this thing up. One of the first ways to do this, if you had to unwrap this from scratch, I would take an edge like this. So I just double click it. So I'm double clicking the donut edge. I can go in the UV editor, shift right click, cut. I'd probably do the same thing on an interior loop going around here. So this is going around the whole kind of curvature of the inside of the donut, I guess. I'll do the same thing. I'll cut. So I'll go back to shell mode, grab all the mesh pieces. I'm going to simply go into Unfold. Unfold handles this kind of more complex stuff very, very well. Right? Flattens it out. Looks pretty much distortion free. Right? So all I really did there is I defined the borders. I did a rough, closest shape I could get to, because the main tools for quick unwrapping are planar. There's a spherical one, but I find it kind of crappy. Works in some cases really well. Cylindrical. And then there's automatic. Automatic is actually, it's almost like a box. So it takes a snapshot of an object from 6 sides. I'll show you that one in a second. But you see, this is, you know, if I had to do something complex and curved like tubes and pipes and stuff, and I didn't have good unwraps to start with, I'd probably do something like that. Go along the length of the pipe and then cut it somewhere so it could flatten out with Unfold really, really quickly. Now, I mentioned the box unwrap. So sometimes if you're in a hurry, this is my cheap and dirty technique. So if you sometimes have a lot of objects, a lot of architecture going on, you can go, let's actually pop open the UV editor again. Now this is nice and clean, but if I were in a hurry, I could simply go automatic. Problem is, seams. Probably distortion. But if it's something off in the distance that a director's like, add this, and we got like 2 minutes to render, and you're like, ah, there you go. Unwrapped. Done. So, and you know, there are always exceptions to the rules that I'm kind of talking to you about, and this is sort of one of those situations where sometimes you can get away with something like this. As a quick first unwrap. Not necessarily final production, but in some cases final production. Yeah, 3D is a very intense field, right? It's sometimes wonder why we do it, but because cartoons, that's why. Man, I didn't do the triangle today, but I should have thought about it, because that sucks. Look at that thing. It's terrible. Okay, so what I could simply do is grab a face, grab each face, and just simply go shift right click, create shell. Let's go to face mode, shift right click, create shell. Oops, face, shift right click, create shell. I'm going to grab them all, let Unfold do its magic. Boom, distortion free. Yo! All right, so I think that's it for now. We'll take a 20-minute break, come back,